Testament 6.1. Today we're going to talk about the Gospel of Luke. Our learning objectives are similar to those of our previous class sessions where we've studied other Gospels. We're going to use the historical critical method to read the Lucan Gospel and see what insights it brings us. We're going to look at the setting and life of the author and audience. Do you remember the German phrase that means setting and life? If you don't know off the top of your head, I want you to look it up and commit it to memory because that's a very important phrase. And lastly, we're going to get a deeper sense of how, why, and for whom this news is good. So just as a bit of a review, remember our timeline. It begins with the Hellenistic period as far as we're concerned for the case of the New Testament. And it's in that period that we not only see the spread of sort of a cosmopolitan attitude toward social development coming from Alexander the Great and all that he brought eastward across the Mediterranean. But we also see the rise of the Roman Empire, and it's in that crucible there that we see the Jewish kingdom of the Hasmoneans rise as an independent entity and then fall as becoming dependent upon Rome until it's ultimately squashed by Rome in 70 CE. But the story that we're concerned with today happens within that green period, but of course you'll see some overtones to the Hellenistic period and also some developments behind its creation that are largely indebted to what Alexander the Great made to happen in the Mediterranean world. So let's get into it. So recall that in Hellenism, we see the spread of Koine Greek as the standard common language among all the people sort of taken in this wave of cultural development. So people are learning to speak Koine Greek as a way to relate with each other outside of their city-state or region or whatever the principality is where they're found, right? Alexander the Great and eventually his lieutenants are going to rule over all of this. But the method of exchange here is going to be in Koine Greek as a language. The site of exchange is going to be the polis. That's the standard social pattern of a city across the Mediterranean. And it's there where you will see in full effect that cosmopolitan attitude, that cosmopolitan sensibility that defines the Hellenistic period. So where do people learn all of this? Well, they're learning it at the Acropolis, right? The high places in the city, in the polis. They learn it in the agora, the marketplace, where people are exchanging goods, services, ideas, traditions, customs. So that's happening in the polis as well. The gymnasium is the school site where people are working out not only their bodies, but also their minds through a process called paideia. Paideia is sort of the term used for education in the Greek world. So that's happening in the Hellenistic period. And the Roman Empire, when it rises around 31 BC, it's going to take what was built and from the Hellenistic period, use what is good for the purposes of Rome, and repurpose everything according to this thing we call the Pax Romana. That is the cultural sensibility of the Roman Empire to make peace happen all over the unified world, not just by way of fighting forces, but also by the cultural sensibilities in which peace is what people want to have happen in their time. Even our foreign policy today, we often say in the United States, peace in our time. Well, this is what was being realized in the Roman Empire. It happened because of the leadership of this man, Octavian, who was the grandnephew and adopted son and heir of Julius Caesar. He avenges Caesar and eventually reestablishes the Senate. And remember these phrases by which he's referred, these names, these titles. He's princeps. He's the first among many, or the first even among equals. So he's kind of the leader, the one who's out front taking charge. He is Augustus. He is the Great. He is Pontifex Maximus, which means supreme bridge builder. So he's connecting lands as far east as they are from west. He's also connecting the heavens to the earth. All of this is being united in his hand, in his authority, largely because he is Divi Filius. He is a son of the divine. He's a son of God. So Romanization works because Koine Greek, again, is a common language that's uniting everyone, though the Roman Empire is going to officially run off of Latin when it comes to their documentation, but Greek is how they reach out to everyone that they have conquered or are ruling, right? Because if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and Greek is getting the job done. Now, Rome has a two-pronged strategy to ruling, and we're going to see this take shape in the Gospel of Luke, probably clearer than we have in any other gospel. And this two-pronged strategy involves Caesar sending out governors or procurators. Those are the Roman officials that go out and observe a principality or region. So Pontius Pilate would be one of those. We're going to meet another one too in the Gospel of Luke. Also, Caesar tends to appoint client kings, people from within the group being ruled. So in the case of our setting, this is going to be the Herodian dynasty, right? They're from that land called Idumea, which is in the south of Judea, southwest of Judea, actually. And the Herodians come out from there, and Caesar appoints them as ruling elite figures. And both offices are there to make sure that the news of Rome is spread all throughout the empire, and taxes get back to Rome in thanks and in support of the Pax Romana and all that the emperor is doing. And again, this is all part of having that cosmopolitan political attitude. Now, how does it spread? Yes, it spreads in all the same ways that it did in Hellenism, but Rome takes it to the next level by making sure that, right, the supreme bridges are built. These include roads, these include waterways that are safe from pirates, this includes legions to protect anyone who is traveling within the confines of the Roman Empire. And it's also great architecture that reminds you who runs all of this. If you look around the Roman world, you're going to see buildings that say, yes, this is property of Caesar, or this is in tribute to Caesar, or this happened because of Caesar. Do you want to cross that person who's erecting gigantic buildings? No. So this is just to keep you minding your P's and Q's. So architecture is a very important tool of domestic policy as well. And in the picture of the Romanization slide, I've never mentioned what this site is. It's called Caesarea Maritima. It's going to be on your map. It's also called Sebaste, which is the Greek word used to refer to the Caesars. Anyway, this is a land that was built in honor of Caesar. You get a lot of this all around the Roman Empire. And so it's a sea town or sea polis built on the side of the water. And it's in honor of Caesar. And this is actually where Pontius Pilate rules from usually, but you're going to find out in Luke, of course, that he leaves this place and goes down to Jerusalem to make sure things are all good during the Passover. So hopefully no one gets too rowdy, right? Because his job is to keep the peace. We'll see how well people are keeping the peace in the Gospel of Luke and what peace looks like as we get into the text itself. So this is the region that we're talking about here. This is the Levant, okay? And you see the Sea of Galilee there. You see the Jordan River. You see the Dead Sea. Begin committing this land to memory. You want to know where these places are because then the gospel will make a lot more sense, especially the Gospel of Luke, which seems to be really keen on painting a picture of history with geography and details about customs. Here you see the Tetrarchy. You also want to commit this to memory. And of course, you can't go wrong by studying the map that I've given you in the course modules. So I think if you look at the that very first course module where it has all sorts of sort of orienting documents, you'll see the map for this unit. Study that. There's a blank one. There's one with that has everything filled out. There's a list of all the places you're responsible for. I want you to be drilling this on your own. That's part of your 4th hour activity. And in your interactive notebook, we're going to do another quick sheet. So go ahead and pause this video and make your quick sheet form, and then we'll go through and fill it out accordingly. You know how to do this, so here we go. The Gospel of Luke, according to most biblical scholars, was written between 85 and 95. So that's putting it a little bit after Matthew. It's definitely putting it after Mark. And why do we think this? Well, again, this gospel seems to presume the destruction of the Second Temple, so it's going to have been around after 70. It also presumes the rise of the Gentiles. In 21 verse 24, when Jesus is talking about what's going to go down at the temple, he speaks about the sort of triumph or rise or the time or the age of the Gentiles, depending on your translation. And this is all this to say that there's going to be a point in the history that the Gospel of Luke lays out in which it's just bound to happen that the Gentiles are going to take over. They're going to take over Jerusalem. They're going to take over Judea. That's just what is going to happen. It is fated. And this is an important motif in the Gospel of Luke, that things don't happen willy-nilly. It's all part of a cosmic timeline. And the Gospel of Luke is laying it out so that you can understand for whom and how and why the news is good. So one of the things that's laid out in this history is that there's going to be a time of the Gentiles, and it's about to come into fruition. So that gives us a sense that, yeah, it must already be going on. Additionally, the Gospel of Luke is completely forthcoming about the fact that it is not an eyewitness account. Like if you look at Luke 1, the author says there was a time when there were eyewitnesses, and those eyewitness accounts went down to other disciples or other followers of Jesus. And it's about time that there's an orderly account that makes all of this plain for anyone who wants to know the Jesus story. This is not written by a guy who was like, I was there, I saw it with my own two eyes. No, this guy's authority comes from the fact that he has read everything there is to know about this Jesus guy, and he's going to lay it out so you hear it loud and clear. And so you'll see in your synoptic gospel chart that this gospel actually borrows heavily from Mark. It even perhaps builds on Matthew and seems very Gentile focused. You look at the Luke 7, you're going to see that Jesus heals a centurion. You're going to see in Luke 23 sort of how Jesus deals with Pontius Pilate and other Gentiles. It just seems to be that this gospel is all right with Gentiles, which gives us a sense that if that's the status quo, that the Jesus story has spread to such a place that Gentiles are curious about it, well, then it must have been some time since this Jesus thing had kicked off. And we know around the end of the first century that Christianity, as we refer to it today, is not just a Jewish enterprise, but it's an enterprise that involves Gentiles from throughout the Mediterranean. So we're going to take a look at why this is good news in the next slide. Maybe first we should say how it becomes good news, or how this good news is presented. And the Gospel of Luke, more than anything we have read thus far, historicizes the setting. If you want to know about the Sitzum Laban for this text is what the Gospel of Luke tells you is happening and what you need to know about it. So, for instance, Luke chapter 2, we learn who is Caesar. It's Augustus. We learn who the governor of Syria is. It's Quirinius. So that's like the procurator. He's the Pontius Pilate of the early days, but in the Syria region. Then later on in chapter 3, it's the 15th year of Tiberius who comes after Augustus. That's who's Caesar. And who's the procurator? Who's the governor? It's Pilate, and he's the governor of Judea. So this is who we are taking a look at when we are reading the Gospel of Luke. We get great detail about what is going down, who's in charge, because it gives us a sense that this stuff did actually happen, and it matters. It matters to the history of the Roman Empire. Now, we don't just get the sort of timeline that does it. It's not just about this is what happened at this moment and this moment. We get narrative explanations as to why things go down. We learn in this gospel why Joseph goes to Nazareth from Bethlehem. From Nazareth to Bethlehem. Because when there's a census, everyone has to go back to the house that they belong to. He belongs to the house of David. If you know your Hebrew Bible, the house of David originates from Bethlehem, this little village. So Joseph takes his family from Galilee to Judea in order to make that happen. It's also in accordance with the scriptures, which is a key thing that happens in this gospel as well. We also see in Luke 23, right, that Herod and Pilate are friends, except they weren't friends before, but when push comes to shove and they're trying to figure out what to do about this Jesus guy, they seem to get along quite well, and it literally says that they're friends. And in Luke 4, especially verse 43, we get descriptions of Jewish customs and how things must go down with, in accordance with the Jewish scriptures. So what does this tell us about the author and the audience? Likely that this is a Roman-trained, right, Paideia-trained, educated writer, someone who went through gymnasium, someone who knows how to communicate in the language and idiom of cosmopolitan people. And this author is trying to situate the good news not just within the Jewish custom, but in Roman history. He is what your textbook and even your footnotes will sometimes refer to as a God-fearer. That is, someone who is a Gentile, but who has respect for the God of the Jewish covenant. They see something compelling in the Jewish covenant, and they're like, you know what? I like it. I dig that. They're not Jewish, but they dig it. They are, I don't want to say wannabes, they are in great admiration that they want to be sort of adopted into that covenant relationship. Some of these people show up at the synagogue. Some of these people study the Jewish scriptures. Some of them even go so far as getting circumcised when they're adults. That's pretty hardcore. This is how much some of these people find the Jewish custom to be of good news to them. And in this gospel, we are getting words to such people, Jews and Gentiles alike, who find this covenant relationship worthwhile within the larger history of the Roman Empire. So if there's a sort of research question to this history, and this gospel is written more than any other in the genre of history, that question is going to be, why should a Gentile follow a Jewish teacher? And the answer is because Jewish scriptures and sign prophets foretold the coming of the Messiah. He is here for people of all classes. He's going to bring a true sort of pax or peace, and it's not going to make Gentiles look bad. And these Jewish people have a history and a temple. The Gospel of Luke is pretty respectful of Jewish people so far as he goes to great lengths to show, yeah, these people, they've been around the block. They've got a past. They've got origins. They've got customs, traditions, a civilization that is worth maintaining, if not just to show how glorious the Roman Empire is for conquering them, but also to be able to repurpose that history for the good of, well, the news of the ruler, which, yeah, you could say is a Caesar. In this picture, it's Tiberius here. But we know who the true Savior is in the Gospel of Luke, right? And that's Jesus Christ. So the structure of the Gospel of Luke it's similar to Matthew, I would say, in that it has multiple pieces. It's a long gospel, but I think you'll see some other features here in this outline that are worth keeping in mind when you're trying to distinguish between Matthew and Luke, for instance. The Gospel of Luke starts off with this preface. You get to Theophilus, right? Theophilus means God lover. Theos means God. Philos means love, like Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. So this is to a God lover, and maybe that means God-fearer, like someone who wants to get on board with the Jewish covenant even though they're a Gentile. Maybe it's someone's name. People are kind of unclear, but it seems to have at least a metaphorical understanding that it's like, if you love God, if you're going to be about that life, then get on board with this gospel. If only because everybody else is. You get John the Baptist origin story. We didn't get that before. And John the Baptist is actually Jesus' cousin in this story. And you might be asking, like, well, why didn't we hear this before? Well, remember that there are multiple sign prophets in the Sitzim Laban of Jesus. We know this for a fact. And it could be that prior to the gospel traditions telling us otherwise, John the Baptist and Jesus may have actually been rival sign prophets. What does become clear is that as the Christian tradition continues, John the Baptist and Jesus seem to be on the same team, on the same side. And in fact, by the time you go from Mark, where Jesus gets baptized, to Matthew, where there's this sort of scriptural understanding as to why John the Baptist came before Jesus, you get to Luke, and it's like they're related, right? His mom knew my mom. Like, it's a kind of interesting relationship there to bring those two traditions together as one powerful mega fulfillment of Jewish scriptures. And Jesus' origin story, right, is approved not only by John the Baptist, but it's approved at the temple, right? He goes over to the temple after he's born. He also gets circumcised and dedicated. He also withstands a temptation from Satan. So he's God approved too. So this guy's got the goods. He's got the credentials. We move into a part where Jesus is rejected at his own home, but well received otherwise. This is familiar to us. And he's healing and feeding and wonder working in his ministry. He's teaching about the kingdom of God, and he's doing this to Jews and Gentiles alike. You see a little teeter-tottering between his ministry to the Jews and then a little something here for the Gentiles. Ministry to the Jews, a little something for the Gentiles. This is a theme throughout the Gospel of Luke. Jesus establishes himself as a scriptural authority. He's critiquing the Jewish establishment and teachers in Judea. He's got parables. But most importantly, I think, is the sort of fatalistic sense of age and fulfillment and accordance. These are key words that pop up throughout the gospel to say that there is a plan. This gospel sketches out the plan, and the evangelist tells you how Jesus fits into the plan. And remember, this plan is not just the Jewish plan, but it's the Jewish plan, it's the Roman plan, it's the cosmic historical plan. And Jesus has a definite place in it, and readers of this gospel have a place in it too, if they'll just pay attention. There are people who, of course, conspire against and crucify Jesus. Pilate actually seems reluctant to crucify Jesus in this gospel, perhaps more than any of the others. Like 3 times, he's kind of like, I don't want to do this, but you are forcing my hand. Jewish authorities seem to not be flawed because there's something wrong with them. It seems to be a misunderstanding of how the kingdom of God actually works. That seems to be the major critique here. Not that they just are flat out wrong. It's just that they have it twisted about what power looks like, what peace looks like. You could say there's a latent critique of the Roman Empire here, but Luke likes to mind his P's and Q's when it comes to talking about Gentiles. He probably doesn't want to ruin the good thing he has, still being alive as a Christian in this time period. But as you move toward the end of the gospel, you get an interesting twist on the story, right? Jesus is resurrected, the story continues, and it's all about trust and fulfillment. Do you believe that this guy has risen? Do you believe that he's back? Do you believe that it's in accordance with the scriptures? And this belief is not like, did it happen, did it not? If anything, it's much more, did you trust the history that has been laid out before you, before even this gospel text? If you had been paying attention all along the way, if you knew the history, if you knew the signs, then you'd know what to expect. And so when Jesus does return, yes, it's about, do you believe your eyes? But it's also, did you believe in the history that's been laid out? The Gospel of Luke ends with some weird, unique scenes. A communion at the beach where everyone's hanging out and eating fish. We'll get to that later. And also, where do the disciples end up? Do they go out into the nations? No, they wait at the temple. And I think the temple is an important site here. You get a lot of trips to the temple in this gospel. Remember all we said about temples. Temples are the sites where humanity meets the divine in any sort of civilization. It's where sacrifices are given, gifts are given to the divine so that blessings may be received in return. And throughout the Mediterranean, you have, of course, a lot of temples, and they're all oriented to Rome. But in this gospel, you seem to get an orientation that's not against Rome, but certainly not to Rome, though. And the teachings that come from it and the sort of worship that comes from it is much more of an order that is egalitarian, that is for everybody. And you'll see that in some of the passages that we discuss. Think about how Luke levels the playing field for all those in the empire. You could say this leveling is sort of like the scriptures of Isaiah and others. You could also say that this is the realization of Pontifex Maximus, that building of bridges across the whole of the universe. God to humanity, rich to poor, east to west, whatever. It seems to all be happening in the Gospel of Luke, and it is good. So, of course, we're going to have 3 sections that I want you to sort of hone in on. These aren't the only important things in Luke. You, of course, have your own notes and things that you took note of, and I want you to be drawing connections between those. But I just wanted to point out a few things that are perhaps useful for understanding the Gospel of Luke and our Western cultural heritage. One is that in Luke chapters 1 through 3, we get this historical preface. Historical preface. We get context, right? In chapter 3, verse 18, we get a discussion of the Herodians, and this is that sort of lurid story about Herodias and the daughter and all that stuff, and why they don't like John the Baptist. It's shorter in this story, but in 3:18, you get the sense that the Herodians were subpar as far as client kings go, that they botched this whole thing. And that's important because it gives Luke the context to show why there is a better king of the Jews, and that is Jesus. You also get liturgical formulae. Okay, liturgical just means work of the people. A lot of times people use that term to refer to like the rituals in an Orthodox or Catholic church, like the word prayers that you read aloud together in unison. It's the sort of ritualistic element of the church, but it means work of the people, the thing that people do when they are together to realize who they are in God, I guess. And you get a lot of liturgical formulae in this gospel. The Magnificat, my soul magnifies the Lord, if you're familiar with the Catholic liturgy or some of the classic song tradition of the Western world. My soul magnifies the Lord is super important. Of course, the Ave Maria or the Hail Mary, that comes from Luke 1:41 through 43. And I put an image of one version of the Hail Mary there, and you can sort of see the overlap. Women are really important in this story, in the Gospel of Luke. Women seem to be a model for true discipleship because they're at the end of the social ladder, and they have seemingly complete faith in Jesus. And so it's them who receives word of the good news first. And in fact, women are the first ones to see Jesus at the tomb too. So there's some interesting kind of bookends going on with the role of women. And there are plenty of places throughout the Gospel of Luke in the middle where women are important too. I also want to note that in the historical preface, beside everything else that I had mentioned, ritual detail is really important. Circumcision, why there are sacrifices of 2 turtle doves. I mean, this stuff you get in the Gospel of Luke. Matthew, even though it's written to Jews, doesn't even go into this great detail. You might say because the Jews already know this stuff, and so why should the Gospel of Matthew have to reiterate it for them? But I think in the Gospel of Luke, it goes to prove something that Flavius Josephus actually does and Philo does. These are people who have been trained in Paideia at the gymnasium, who have to justify the role of the Jews in Roman history. And you do that by showing that these people have religio. They have seculare, that is, they have something that binds them together. They have rituals they do. They have a sense of order and propriety. That sense of order and propriety, of course, is subservient to the wishes of Rome. But what Luke is going to do is convince Rome, Gentiles and all, that the good news of this Jesus is the way to fulfill the Pax Romana, is the way to make peace happen in this time, in this place. And it's in accordance with the histories of the Jews, aka their scriptures, and it also is going to be in recognizable patterns of leadership that anyone who is truly cosmopolitan is going to understand. For instance, in Luke 6, verses 17 through 49, we get a sermon, much like the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, but this is the Sermon on the Plain. You don't have a mountain with a Moses motif where Jesus is up on high breaking down how the kingdom of heaven works. No, you get Jesus at the plains, flat land, where he's saying, look, this is what quality is like. This is what it means to live. This is what it means to be. And I don't want to make too much hay over mountain versus plain, except to say that it does seem to level the playing field. It does seem to make a more equitable illustration of the kingdom. One that speaks to, or at least is reinforced by, the liberties Luke takes from the Matthean tradition, where Matthew talks about the poor in spirit. In Luke, you get just the poor. It's not people who thirst for righteousness. It's people who are thirsty. It's not people who hunger for whatever. It's people who are actually hungry. The Gospel of Luke gets it right, that gets it real, like keeps it 100. Is like, I know that the Pax Romana has not fed your belly. It has not quenched your thirst. So I've got some good news for you. Congratulations, because the kingdom of heaven is here. It's near. I'm bringing it. I am it. And you can be a part of it too. And note that true followership is not knowing everything already. It's saying, well, it's coming to realize that you got to follow Jesus in a true way in which you show your trust. So there's that passage where it says, why do you call me Lord, Lord, but don't do what I say? And then it's followed by the healing of a centurion servant. It's fascinating, right? A centurion servant or centurion slave, really. This is a Gentile. And Jesus heals a Gentile right after laying out what the kingdom of God looks like. I mean, he's making it plain for people. And in fact, if you look at that section with the centurion is present in the Jewish lands, and he's like, my slave is sick. The centurion tells the Jewish authorities around them, like Jewish elders, I believe, and says, go get this Jesus guy. I heard he's a healer. And the elders go up to Jesus and they're like, look, we need you to do us a solid and heal this guy because this guy's been good to us. All right, we've got a good thing going. He built our synagogue. He was like very like a philanthropic. All right, he went above and beyond to make sure we're good. So let's do right by him. Help us out. Heal this guy. And so Jesus goes, and Jesus is surprised at how trusting this guy is of what to the centurion should be a foreign, weird superstition. But Jesus recognizes this guy's faith and is like, I haven't even seen this kind of thing in Israel. That's hot. Same energy. Let's keep it up. And that's the model for everybody who reads the Gospel of Luke. You can be a Jew. You can be a Gentile. Are you going to be like the centurion? Are you going to put your faith in someone who may seem super strange, super weird? Because if you are, good things are ahead. The last section I want to bring out is the end, and it's Luke 24, and I call it Communing with Jesus. Here you see that women are first to witness the resurrection. It's wild, right? Women, not the men we've been hearing about all this time, especially in the other Gospels, but it's women, and we even get names here. This shows just sort of how upside down this world is, to quote a former professor here at the college, Don Crable. This is an upside down kingdom. In the face of patriarchy, women get a shout out, okay? And what's really amazing here is that it's so terrestrial. This whole ending is very terrestrial. Human beings are hanging out with Jesus, like really hanging out. They have a fish fry. I mean, it's broiled fish, but they're hanging out at the beach eating fish. And you'll recall at the beginning, and they're eating bread too, right? I mean, this is legit. It's lit. I mean, they're having a kind of a weird situation, like a party here. Except it's not a party. It's more of like they're just chopping it up. You'll recall they're the two guys who are leaving Jerusalem, and this figure comes up and is like, hey, what went down? And they're like, are you kidding me? Are you the only person who doesn't know what just happened? That this Jesus guy died, but supposedly came back. I mean, that's what's good. Like, we're trying to figure out what's happening, and his body's gone. And the guy goes and is like, look, did you not pay attention to everything? And the guy lays out like everything according to the Jewish scriptures, right? It's all about fulfillment. He's like, if you had known that the Messiah was supposed to die, is supposed to suffer at the hands of humanity, then you'd realize, oh yeah, this was supposed to happen. It happened in its time. The crucifixion was planned, more or less. And now guess what? You get the next chapter when Jesus rises and they eat the bread and they're like, yo, it's Jesus. And they run back and they go to the disciples. The disciples are like, yeah, we already saw him. Peter saw him. And they're like, whoa. And everyone's like, yeah, this Jesus guy's back. And Jesus comes back and he's like, feel my hands. Like, I'm flesh and blood. I'm here in the flesh. 24:39. And what happens at the end? They are to return to the temple. The disciples are returned to the temple and wait. Because the temple is the site where God meets humans, and something's about to go down. These humans are going to be shrouded in the power of the Spirit, something that's going to equip them to go about and make this good news known to the world. And just to give you a spoiler alert, we're going to get the second part to this gospel in the book of Acts, which is written by the same dude, and it picks up right where we left off. So that's going to come up after our first exam. But I want to show you on this image here, you see it says ichthus in Greek. This means fish. This is actually in the intro or first chapter to your book. It says Jesus Christos Theos Huios Soter, which means Jesus Christ, God, Son, Savior. Jesus Christ, the Savior, the Son of God. The order doesn't really matter so much in Greek, but this is what this Jesus fish means, right? And the iconography probably comes from the Gospel of Luke. Right, that these people are sitting together eating fish. It also comes from all those passages in which Jesus is like, I'll make you fishers of people. But this notion that Jesus is the Son of God who goes out to the fisher people, right, to the farmer, to the hungry, to the poor. This is a pretty hands-on and ground level gospel. And that's what makes this good. And if you are at all up on what makes peace a thing in this world. If you think about what Caesar was trying to make happen, if you think about what the Herodians were supposed to be doing and what Pontius Pilate was supposed to be overseeing, then you realize that peace is about meeting people's needs, giving them everything they have in the polis, a marketplace where they can get goods and education, that they have a city with temples like the Acropolis on top so that they know where they fit into the world. All of this should be part of an existence under a good king. That's peace. The Gospel of Luke lays out what that really looks like. And if you can get on board with that, there's room at, well, the fish fry for you. So how is this historical critical reading of the Gospel of Luke changed your understanding of the New Testament? And what is coming together for you? Take some time to really look at the footnotes of this section, look at the synoptic Gospels parallels, and also take a look at all the stuff you've been reading in the textbook. It's been a while since we've gone back into the textbook. I've been challenging you to bring some of that out, but skim through some of those key terms and key ideas and see what sense it can make for you now, because you have a much larger context in which to fit in the world of the New Testament into the text alongside of artifacts that we've looked at. So next time we're going to be hearing from our group presentation about the prodigal son, and we should be back in class together on Wednesday. So I look forward to it. Stay healthy, everybody.